welcome to the Juste Podcast with Tim Buxton, proudly recorded on Yugambeh country, the land of the Kombumerri saltwater people of the Gold Coast, Australia. Through courageous conversations with leaders and pioneers across diverse fields, we'll unpack the important, often complex topics that are shaping our world today and explore what it takes to create lasting, positive change in our communities. Each episode you'll be inspired by entrepreneurs, educators, artists, humanitarians, and unsung everyday heroes doing the extraordinary work it takes to build a just world. A world filled with hope, belonging, and boundless possibilities. So, without further ado, let's dive into another courageous conversation, inspiring change. Hey friends, I hope you're liking the newly reimagined Juste Podcast, where we explore courageous conversations at the intersection of justice, beauty, and positive social impact. I'd love to hear what you think of the new vibe and direction, so please don't be shy. Today, though, I'm excited to introduce to you Tom Dawkins, and he is a visionary social entrepreneur. He's founder of StartSomeGood and a few other things, as most entrepreneurs are. And we recorded this episode a little while ago, but it's relevant now more than ever. We're jumping in just a couple minutes into our chat where Tom's sharing about this, his early years growing up in a home, deeply engaged with global issues. So without further ado, let's dive in.
And my mum really cared about and talked a lot about the role of public broadcasting in a democracy as a forum for diverse voices. She was a pioneer with feminist broadcasting, Indigenous broadcasting, regional and rural broadcasting in Australia. And so I guess I just grew up in this, this kind of context whereby, to me, that was what work was. It was a place in which you went to pursue the social changes that you cared about and where you kind of lived out your beliefs, your actions. Now, that left me without a lot of direction, I have to say, until I found a certain sense of purpose. Because I didn't have that kind of construct in my head of, just go to school, get good grades, go to a university, get a job kind of thing. I was like, no, sure. I'm not looking for a job, I'm looking for a cause. But, you can't just kind of find one in the shop necessarily. But it did make me very versed around, we also, obviously, as you might imagine from the kind of description so far, we watched the news a lot in my family. We read the newspaper. We talked about news almost every day, current events as well as Absolutely. Big picture political themes around the dinner table. So and that was key because it meant that when opportunity kind of popped up, I was versed in articulating my own views, poorly informed as they mostly were at the time. I was used to battling it out with better informed people, arguing with my parents about politics, And so that prepared me then for a very unique, unusual sliding doors kind of a moment in my life, which is I actually really struggled in high school. I was doing really badly and, because I didn't have that kind of sense of just work ethically, and get grades, jobs, whatever. And I didn't have any sense of purpose myself. That left me drifting a little bit. I got into a selective high school and then performed really badly. And it's funny how quickly you forget the context. Like, the fact that everyone at this school is smart, you just forget that when you are out of 100 kids in maths. You're just like, I'm not smart. You don't go, hey, we're all smart here. And, someone has to be. So I generally had a kind of,
But can I get in that moment, right? Like, because there's a lot of people that feel like they're in a system that makes them present poorly. But at the same time, like that smartness or intellect could be, there's more ways that you're attuned to learning that other people aren't. Not to kind of give you a pass that, hey, look, there wasn't in that case, but I guess it's like that. It sounds like as you're talking, there was something different about you that the system wasn't ready for, maybe, and that's precisely what makes it.
I mean, I'm a late in life diagnosed ADHD person, which is like shockingly.
Hey, same here. I have just recently been officially in the last year.
Was it because your kids were diagnosed first, which made you and your wife curious about
it? Was totally because my kids, my youngest in particular, was struggling in prep, and we had to keep him back, and they're like XYZ, and then you start digging into it, and then I'm like, and it's genetic, and then I look at my own parents, and then I look at myself, and I'm like, then the path came for me, right? And so anyways, I kind of wanted, sorry to stop you in your tracks there, but it was almost like there was something more than just you're performing bad. It's like, well, why? Where is that?
And later I
coming
discovered, as I have no doubt you did as well, that when I found things I was genuinely interested in, I had a kind of enormous capacity to focus in on them and to dig in and learn and, follow through. I'm really good at, things that, people that aren't associated with ADHD, but actually it's just, but you got to find those things. And it's why I do think you do often see a disproportionate number of, I think you see a lot of people with ADHD in the kind of entrepreneurial community in general, because it's that combination, it's that classic Richard Branson. If you've read his autobiography, one of his teachers said to him, you'll either be a billionaire or in jail. And it is kind of that not great with systems, doesn't fit well. And that can go, different directions.
Because you're too busy connecting all the other systems rather than just conforming to the system that exists. Exactly. You're seeing beyond and connecting and that's where you live. Anyway,
But I think that's even more true. I think that's even more pronounced in the kind of social purpose founder community, because I think fundamentally, I need that. If I don't really feel that drive and that purpose and that deeper connection, I'm functionally incapable of selling out, to be honest. I've tried a couple of times. The last time I just had, and this isn't even selling out. I was working for a nonprofit doing important work. It was just a well-paid and relatively cushy job that didn't push me or stress me out too much. And the last time that happened, I founded StartSomeGood. I'm just incapable of just taking my blessings in that regard and sticking with it. So 4 months later, I was quitting that great job. Living in California, great life
with a credit card for business expenses that you never had to worry or think about as long as you kept within. Yeah.
So this is a classic story of that. But to jump forward a little bit and try to get through, because we're up to something. But no, in year 10, I stumbled onto this concept of a student exchange, which is not something I was familiar with at all at the time. And it only happened, speaking of sliding doors moments, I was kicked out of English class. I was talking too much, not very focused. You might resonate with that as well. And that left me in the corridor reflecting on the injustice of the world, but also incredibly bored. And I'm really hopeless at just being left on my own with nothing to stimulate me. And so there was a brochure that someone had dropped in the corridor, and out of desperation, I had a muddy footprint on it and stuff. And out of desperation, I picked that up to read it because I just desperately needed to read something. And it was for a student exchange program. And I didn't even know that such a thing existed. And I went home that night and said, Mum, Dad, I'm going to go to America for a year. And they were shockingly supportive. I think actually they thought I was causing a lot of trouble at home as well. I think they thought, a year off.
Get rid of him for a year. God.
Send the disruptive teenager away for a year, you. And so that would have been a really formative experience in and of itself. But then in another random sliding door, coincidences on coincidences moment, I was there when this amazing event happened. By there, I mean being in America on that year, when an event happened called the State of the World Forum. Anyone younger than me, this will be before their time. But I was in the State right during this kind of interesting moment post the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, when no one knew how to talk about anything. Because for the entire previous 50 years, the Cold War had been the frame through which you talked about everything. You couldn't talk about anything in international relations other than through the frame of the Cold War. You couldn't talk about war and peace. You couldn't talk about trade and fair trade. You couldn't talk about climate and environmentalism other than by contextualizing it in this global system that was the Cold War. And that disappeared practically overnight. And no one really knew how to kind of talk about what our goals were as a kind of civilization, as a global community anymore. The goals had been win the Cold War on either side, or stay out of the Cold War for some, and do the best we could. And there was a series of kind of, conversations and high-level meetings that took place during that time that eventually led to the creation of the Millennial Development Goals, which became the Sustainable Development Goals, as a way of articulating that kind of global to-do list. But this was kind of during the fuzzy period before that emerged. And this event called the State of the World Forum happened as part of that process. And I like to imagine, don't know exactly how this happened, but I think at some point in the process, someone said, well, if we're talking about the future, wouldn't it be nice to have some young people here? But they didn't have the budget at the time, the inclination, whatever it was, to do a true, global search for worthy young leaders. So they do the smart thing that you should do in those circumstances, which is they partnered. And they partnered with AFS, which was then the world's biggest student exchange organization, to select from young people who are already conveniently located in America, but from other countries. I happened to be with AFS. It wasn't the brochure I picked up. That was for a different organization, but I ended up with AFS a year later.
Yeah.
With that short-term goal, just quick aside, I had to pull my grades up in order to be allowed to go on exchange. And with that as a really clear now, a kind of short-term goal and reason to care I understood, I was able to do that. And so then I found myself there. Of the 61 of us Australians who were there on the year program, 5 of us were invited to write an essay why I would like to attend the State of the World Forum. I'm not even sure why I was selected as one of the 5, other than I probably mouthed off about politics at some point during the introduction Republican camp, and they were like, he seems like he might be interested in that, but who knows the randomness and bias that can go into, that shortlisting right there.
Sure.
Because I had been trained on like arguing about politics with my parents, I wrote a compelling essay, an argument as to why I should be going. And then suddenly, before I knew it, and really with no right to be there whatsoever, if they had done a global search for young leaders, A, I wouldn't have heard about it because my school didn't share those sorts of opportunities. B, if I'd heard about it, I wouldn't have applied because it didn't sound like me. And if I'd applied, I obviously wouldn't have been selected because there must have been amazing 15 to 17-year-old Australian social entrepreneurs and change makers at the time, but who missed out on that opportunity because I got it instead by being on exchange with the
right place, right
time. And so I, turned up at this event in San Francisco as one of 61 young people. And it was almost like that episode of Thank God You're Here. Like we walked through a door and then people said, thank God you're here. And we had to kind of figure out what that meant and what we're meant to do. But they literally said to us, you're here to represent 3.4, I forget the exact number now, but billion young people on Earth. The average age of the world's population is 16. Thank God you guys are here as part of this conversation as to what the goals of the global community should be. And I'm like, what are we talking about? I don't know anything about this stuff. And it was the most intense and overwhelming experience of my life, but also one of the most stimulating, inspiring. We met Nobel Peace Prize winners. We met Thich Nhat Hanh, the equivalent of the Dalai Lama for the Vietnamese Buddhists.
Come on.
We met Mikhail Gorbachev. I met these other amazing young people who came, I think collectively we were from 32 different countries. Met people from places I barely heard about, let alone knew anything about. And so all of that was incredibly amazing. And all these important people listened to us. And that was, the most deeply empowering experience of my life. But as I kind of came down from that high in the weeks afterwards, and I thought a little bit about the experience, and I kept thinking about those random coincidences that had allowed me to be there. And I realized that is fundamentally, or at least I suspected, having not been really encountered it before, but I had a strong suspicion that that was what youth representation looked like. That it was tokenistic, it was haphazard, and it was biased towards wealth. Because every single one of us, while we had this incredible diversity on many levels, there were 61 of us in the youth delegation from 32 countries. We were black and white and brown and, from the first world and the second world and the third world, from every continent, But every single one of us had parents who could afford to send us to America on exchange. Every single one of us came from a country that was served by AFS as an American Student Exchange organization. And kind of what I've been trying to figure out ever since, and more or less working on ever since, is how do we give that experience to everyone? Not that precise experience, but how do we help everyone realize what I realized through those experiences was that my voice could matter. And that while I certainly wasn't deluded enough to think that my voice was uniquely special, in fact, the opposite, that it's that everyone should have the opportunity to know that their voice does matter, their perspective matters, their ideas for the future matter. And it's only by unlocking, I think, kind of those ideas and all of that potential energy and, collaborative potential that we're going to be able to create the future that we need and want as well. And that's what I've pretty much been working on ever since. I founded then a non-profit high school student organization, then a university student organization, then a non-profit that continues.
Was it a co-working space?
Opened the first co-working space to try and bring change makers together to work on projects. And then 4 years in the US, at the end of which I founded StartSomeGood before moving home, and now LendForGood.
So it's taken you around the world and back again, raising a family now into the mix. I was going to ask you what's then that core value that now drives you, because there's the seed and there's the like your experiences growing up, and then how it just tends to kind of domino into that. But then there's something unique about you in your essence, I think too. Like there's an angle that amongst all social entrepreneurs, there's some layer or something that's unique that drives them. And hearing you say that I wanted everyone to have the same opportunity to experience what I had experienced. There's that line you just kind of shared gave me a hint to maybe what that might be. And sometimes it's really hard to kind of define, hey, this is really at the end of the day what boils it down to, what matters to me. I found in my own journey, just as an example, like belonging is actually at the core sense of, and whether you call that inclusion, to me, you call that the fact that everyone deserves to feel like when they walk into a room that they belong there, that there shouldn't be an in-group and an out group, that like, hey, everyone at this room, like there's nothing worse speaking backstage in an event and you go into the green room and there's those people that all get together and you're kind of by yourself and you feel it and you know it, and no matter how much you're not on the end, that to me is the ultimate experience, whether I felt that growing up because I didn't feel like I belonged, whatever that may have been. That's kind of driven me. Like in anything I do, I just kind of have that angle to it. Is there something for you that kind of might, like, I'm just kind of trying to maybe dig too far, but just
No, I mean, I think that the equivalent concept that has probably been most important for me through my life is democracy.
Yeah.
Which I think is this combination of knowing that you belong, but also that you have power, that you influence. I mean, it might be a better word, and the ability to kind of how that is enshrined, exercised. And it's not about elections. I mean, I was very fun, I used to talk about this more directly. To me, elections are to a democracy as AGMs are to a business, that you have to have an annual general meeting. They're a really important administrative function. If you don't have them, something is likely to go wrong. But no one would say that's the heart of what business is, and I think in the same way that you got to have elections. Elections are really important. It's where we elect the administrators of our democracy, and they provide a set of really important functions, just like a board does in a company.
Yeah.
But that's not how you can kind of really measure, or certainly not the only way, not necessary but insufficient to measure the overall health of democracy or how democratic a country is. It's whether people feel that opportunity, that calling, that belonging, that allows them to know that their actions matter and their voice matters, and that they can be. But you don't obviously get everything you're part of. Being in democracy is also losing gracefully sometimes as well.
Wow.
As certain things are put to the test, and you discover that you are not in the majority, and that's how it has to go. But again, it's not just about those voting moments; it's about participation to me. And so, that's always I think been really core to almost pretty much everything I've done. It's a big part of why I founded StartSomeGood. Was in some ways I thought we wanted to democratize funding and innovation and people needed opportunities. And then our line for our motto for LendForGood these days is democratizing impact investment.
Democratizing.
So I think that's probably my equivalent of belonging. I really like belonging as well. I do think it's an interesting concept though, because I do think community is one of those fascinating concepts. That's because communities also imply if you don't know whether it begins or ends, it's probably not a community, it's a culture, which is a different thing and also very interesting. But communities have to have recognizable boundaries, or else you don't know that you are safely in your community. So there is this kind of fascinating kind of juxtaposition or play sometimes.
There's a tribe and there's
safety and belonging.
Yes.
But often safety and belonging is not, and that's why a good event, just the act of being there should let you know that you're part of this community. If an event is really well produced, whatever that event is, Burning Man, great conferences, backpacker buses up the East Coast, any of those you've engineered, that the moment you're there, you look around and go, here we are. The fact that we're all at this thing together means we're already part of a community. But you're also very aware that there's this boundary just beyond that represents not this.
If you veer too far, you're going to be into a territory, a border or whatever that you cross that you pose a threat. And I think that's the beautiful thing, right? These all tie back into whether it's the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, where there's this sense of dignity with every single person, and this sense of everyone belongs at the table. And when it comes to building the society that we all have to share together, like the world, we have to share this planet. So we, whether we like it or not, everything impacts everything. And so we need everyone to feel like they're owning and taking part in that. That element you bring in though is this, it's beyond just you have a seat at the table, but it's recognizing those that might be overlooked and those that might not feel like they have a voice. Their voice is just as important, is equally important as everybody else's. And we shouldn't privilege and put someone's wealth category, whether you're a minority or a majority, does not matter. Every individual's voice needs to be represented, which is what the democratic system, I guess, is designed to do.
Totally. And just to put it into even more kind of practical terms that some might resonate with more than, I think it's also about, almost everyone agrees that innovation is core to the future, then if we're going to be, let's forget being a successful planet, which I think is the right perspective that you were talking about, how we're going to maintain spaceship Earth as the only place where we live. But let's even drill it down again. I do know that, that while there's an attraction in these universal goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals, and talking of planetary systems, and certain of us are attracted to that is a niche always. And generally, more people are more passionate the more specific you get. We teach people to crowdfund a lot, and we don't get people to crowdfund around, kind of food for everyone. They find a ways around. We're going to feed these people over here in this way. The more specific you get, often the more there are constituency people who share that passion. So even let's drill it down to Australia in the spirit of that.
Yes, let's do that.
And say it's if we agree that kind of Australia succeeding, even versus our planetary peers, involves being more innovative and smarter about the future than others. Well, where does innovation come from? I think innovation comes from often the connection between difference and diversity. And so Australia should be an innovation superpower. We have this unique combination of the highest proportion of foreign-born citizens of any country on Earth, plus the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Like those two things is such a unique potential laboratory to try things. Unfortunately, I think we've got quite a conservative political culture, quite a conservative business culture, and quite a conservative investment culture, all all things that, in some ways I've been trying to tackle and address or fill gaps with the work that we're doing that holds some of that back. But I also think there's the issue that sometimes I think is a good framing is to think about utility rate. And I think we have all the ideas we need. There's just a lot of them stuck in unusual heads that we don't know that don't know who to tell or how to frame it. And therefore we don't get the benefit of those insights. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think we're getting the full utility of all the potential creative ideas, the potential innovation in our society. And I always, it's the answer to like, why is Jamaica weirdly good at sprinting? It's because they're the greatest example of like the full utility of available sprinting talent. Like everyone in Jamaica runs in school. It's the dominant sport, compared to soccer a bit, but soccer also involves running. So there's no real trade-off. There's not like the battle between the 5 different football codes in Australia or what have you, it's one or the other.
Right.
And so that's what the full utility of the available talent looks like. It looks like a tiny island somehow improbably generation after generation producing the world's best sprinters. There's no reason they should really, apart from that. And we're not doing that. Clearly, I think, producing, having the benefit of the full utility of the available creativity, innovation, ideas, and so on. And that's a problem on every level. It's not only represents, I think, a certain lack of democracy on a philosophical level. We're missing out on the economic benefit of that innovation, obviously, all the social.
Well, we should be leading the way.
Yeah.
Right. When you're in a position that you should be leading, and you're not, then it kind of is cause for concern. And I think I'd love to kind of dig into that because you and I are both passionate about this, social impact space in obviously coming at it from, our unique perspectives and upbringings and expressions. But, we both started different entities in different ways to make a difference for good. And there seems to be a buzz around it. It's kind of emerging. This social enterprise is kind of like a term. And there's all these terms around, like we didn't even know what an entrepreneur was until like 10, 15 years ago. It seemed it was like a bygone word. Now it's just like a buzzword. And then you tag on like social impact and then the pressures that governments now have to, to save all this stuff is kind of forged a space that is really not, I recently went to a conference designed around this. I certainly don't want to name it, but I was inspired by it and in so many ways, but still feeling like there's echo chambers within this space that the real crossover and convergence that kind of where it's the meeting of business, of government, of philanthropy, and just like people that are community development and community generosity and individual personal responsibility all clash is still it's like a muddy soup, primordial soup still. So what do you see is some of the key challenges facing this social impact space as it is right now? And, where do you see is the most important places to start in terms of addressing those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, my focus is always, on the how do we unlock more of the innovative ideas that are out there. And I think historically, we've just not been very good at investing in innovation in Australia in general, but in the philanthropic sector, which has primarily taken the lead on funding social change and social innovation in particular. And I think some of that comes, there's a whole range of cultural factors for that. So Australia's kind of a uniquely low tax plus low philanthropy country. You tend to get one or the other, like America's low tax, high philanthropy, Scandinavia's high tax, low philanthropy. We're kind of relatively low compared to our rich world peers in both, bottom half of both.
Why? I want to know what makes that.
I mean, I feel like maybe it just shows that in some ways I think we still have some expectation that government should take the lead on a lot of key challenges, but there has been quite a successful political project to defund government, I think, and obviously failures to capture things like the extraordinary mining profits tax been repealed and so on, failing to tax carbon. There's been just politically have kind of lost the key revenue battles. There's been other successes, often, more commonly and important, symbolic, not symbolic, practical as well. I mean, things like same-sex marriage and there's been, kind of some significant progressive victories, but it feels like we've lost all the revenue-related ones.
The financial ones is the finance. Yeah. Well, this is kind of an area where, and not to kind of, I know you were going somewhere and I asked you a question, so I do want you to answer it. But you've kind of like highlighted where I feel like the major issue is it's an economic one. It actually isn't so much like we all generally, people in general, want to do good. Like we want to help each other, especially if it's something that's close to us, and it's like you were saying, we crowdfund. So like at the end of the day, like if we're not threatened, our general inclination is to be generous and kind. There's a great book by someone, a young Dutch guy who wrote called Humankind. And I really enjoyed.
Bregman.
Yes, that's the one. I think so. I can't pronounce his name, so I said.
I love that book. I have a whole little for those, once people have read Humankind, I recommend A Paradise Built in Hell, which is all
Oh,
about how people come together and form incredible self-organized communities after disaster, over
after
and over.
tragedy.
We tell ourselves stories of like everything falling apart the moment the authorities are not there. And, that tends to be what gets amplified on the news after Hurricane Katrina, say, New Orleans. But you actually look at what happened in Katrina, and it's actually mostly the community rallying together to support each other under very difficult circumstances. And those who were afraid of anarchy creating the anarchy through overreaction. Anyway, there's a whole, I'm a big believer that humans are fundamentally good.
And I think,
you know who else was a big believer in that? Actually, Adam Smith, because most of the people who argue about free market economics now have not read any Adam Smith.
right.
And he wrote about how the thing that would constrain business is the relationships of the businessman, he wrote at the time, obviously, to their local community. That it's not in the interest of the baker to make terrible bread. It's not in the interest of the banker to rip off their customers. And that's all really true. The problem is so much of business has been separated from
community.
Being anywhere. Yeah, from community.
Well, and I think we've lost that from our connection to more Eastern cultures, more indigenous cultures, which have front and center the welfare of community. The community supports the whole, or even that saying in Africa that like the kind of clash or the converse to the, I think, therefore I am, statement to I am because we are, right? And it's that understanding of what upholds what. And the minute we say, look, my personal interests actually benefit my ability to survive, our ability as a species, is when I put the community first as opposed to my own self-interest, let's say, at front and center. But I think there's that fundamental belief that people need to have that this isn't a scarce world, that ultimately we are good people. And the more that people, and in particular people in power, and politicians tend to do this a lot, harp on the opposite messaging of this being, we can't afford, we need borders, we can't afford to have this, and that harp on the fear and the scarcity narrative, which I just don't, like, you just need to have a curious look at nature to realize, yes, this can be a cruel world and suffering befalls everyone and all of us one and the same. But time and time again, in the ashes of tragedy, as you highlighted, you see paradise being reformed. You see us connecting and coming together. Fred Rogers once said, whenever you see tragedy or crisis, look for the helpers because they're always there. We just never want to highlight that. And so coming back to kind of the core issue is around this, I feel like it's this economic financial system, which I think leads into really such a powerful segue to Lend for Good and behind that. But yeah.
I mean, just to pull on the thread just a little bit more though, I do think it's, and this is why I am so optimistic about social enterprise, because I do think it is, I do embrace that we have to involve business, that business is a really powerful instrument in our society. Business is an incredible engine for developing innovation, scaling innovation, much better at that actually than the not-for-profit sector. You just fundamentally can't command and control innovation on cue. So you need, just as like the best sporting accomplishment, some people are not into this whole highly competitive, Olympic sports type system, but that is what produces the elite human performance. Is people just don't ride as fast when they're out for a ride as when they're in the Tour de France. Just a human, that's just part of our biology. At a certain point, you got to just embrace, kind of just all monkeys in the end, and that's just a monkey thing. And so I do believe in capitalism on that level. And again, democracy, I don't think they're one and the same, and I certainly don't think one equals the other. And I think, but I think we've got such an unbalanced capitalism now that it's unbalancing our democracy very badly. And it's where I think capitalism, I believe in capitalism, we've just barely tried it, because I think at the heart of a truly capitalist system, and that could bring together what you're talking about, kind of that individual greed I want versus that collective we need, is if things just cost what they cost. And so, and then I think kind of our individual decision making would more systemically kind of line up with the common good, as per that kind of classic Milton Friedman concept. The problem is that things don't cost what they cost. When we buy a litre of petrol, it doesn't in fact cover the costs of extracting and burning that petrol, the cost to the environment and to future generations. When you buy that Big Mac, it does not in fact cover the costs of dealing with the rubbish that is created and the obesity epidemic that's emerging in Australia.
Concerns
exactly. But if so I'm big on, if petrol costs $20 a litre, I know that sounds terrible, but how much further would that push towards
riding your bike,
vehicles, EVs, riding your bike, alternatives? But then if you choose to drive a car, some people, I just think there'll always be internal combustion cars, just like there are still horses. Like some people love that kind of vehicle. That's cool, no disrespect. That you want it, just like having horses is a really expensive hobby, but if you want to prioritize that in your life and make horses, where you're going to spend your money. If you want to make internal combustion engines, how you're going to spend your money to have this incredibly expensive hobby, buying this incredibly expensive petrol, but it's paying for whatever is needed
And
to deal
on
with the
that,
problem, then no harm, no foul. That is aligned. That's where I think social enterprise is already doing that work. You can't just social enterprise your way to this future, because you do need politics is the only vehicle that can, has the coercive power to change the rules. And
yes,
so you do need to change these rules, but you also need the solutions to be ready to when the rules change. And that's where I think social enterprises are essentially building businesses for that future already. It's a classic, the future already
which is
exists.
hard because
It's hard to do because you're taking on the costs often. Yeah, you're doing things that are more
absorbing
expensive.
it.
And the subsidies, it's not that we have like a free and unbiased through government subsidy market right now. It's just that often they flow in the wrong directions. People don't realize how much corporate welfare goes on and how much the government is still subsidizing all sorts of things.
Or upholding a system that
would bring a lot of money back into the system and restore some balance to people's decision making, because you shouldn't have to pay, ultimately heaps more to do the right thing. And where, why I'm so full of admiration to social entrepreneurs that can nail this equation is that if you can do better while still being price competitive, that's where you can really begin to capture significant market share. Right now, that's really hard to do because, being better often involves some form of additional effort or cost. But, the real mainstreaming is to be pretty close on price. That's just the truth of it. We've always had ethical consumers, conscious consumers. They're traditionally been like 10 to 15% of the market, depending on whose report you read. And they're the ones willing to pay more, have always existed. As people often say, not a new thing, social enterprise is true. But it used to be a niche. And if we want to make it the mainstream, price is one of the places where we're going to have to kind of,
be okay with it.
Which is just everyone wants a better deal. No one wants to pay more.
But here's where I think it's so possible and should, in one sense, be, it's not just possible, it's actually in every way attractive. And the reason why I think that is, one thing the cost, there's a friend of mine who she creates these amazing bags out of recycled kite surfing material. They're called Kite Pride, and they're like the highest quality bags, and they're made by those, this is in Tel Aviv, and they're made by generally those from immigrants or backgrounds that are caught up in a bit of a nefarious underground sex industry, right? And so they've needed to escape, but needed work. You need something to get into, and they've made the hard effort, like, hey, let's do this. Let's do it, like, in every way good. And she mentioned this one thing as I'd taken a group of people on one of our trips to visit her headquarters and just be inspired to listen to. She says, if something's cheap, someone else is paying the price. And the thing is that it's not just the price that the planet's placing. It's like, if we stop to ask ourselves, really, I got a great deal's one thing, but when we're actually happy for there to be a win-win, like, I think that's the whole thing of, like, when we look at bartering and we go and barter and people go to Bali and all that stuff, they think that it stemmed out of, like, they love to barter, they love all this. Yeah, but they do have a set price they will not go down on because they're not going to hurt. But bartering is based on that a completely different set of an economic system, and the pressure and the weight that we can take advantage of without really acknowledging the cost, the human cost, as well as all the other costs into how things are. And the funny thing about greed, or the funny thing about, let's say, the price or the cost or what we want to create in society, is we generally are looking to be happy, right? The thing is, we realize that we think that it's producing more stuff and getting more stuff, having more stuff makes us happy. And the fundamental the jury's out, like, having and getting more stuff doesn't generally make you happy. It's usually wanting what you already have or being content with what you have. Now, that does not mean if you're really into cars, you cannot, have a passion or a hobby and want that. But in the economic system we have, it's all built on this idea of just making everyone bigger and consumers of more stuff. And so there's a fundamental, I think, challenge there with how do we promote not only social impact organizations that produce, whether it be more goods or more services, but how do we also address the fact that by promising that this is good doesn't always deal with the core issue of, like, hey, we also need to get used to, like, things costing a lot, because it's okay to just have one. Like, I remember having one pair of jeans when I was growing up, and my mum sewed patches on it that were cool patches to preserve these jeans, because that's all I needed. Yeah. And so there's a challenge beyond.
I think that's right. But I do think that that's, again, where there will need to be some fundamental rule setting that forces the incorporation of minimum standards
The limits
that,
standards,
in terms of, what fair trade standards globally, as well as obviously kind of true cost economics, things costing what they need to cost. It's not going to be, while I 100% agree with everything you say, and I'm willing to do that myself. I do think that's one of those things that, again, people have been saying forever and is absolutely spot on, and we should continue to preach. But we're not going to wake up tomorrow and everyone's suddenly had just an active personal transformation in the way that they think and what they value and what they're willing to pay for. And so, I think we will keep incrementing our way towards that. It is why many social enterprise products do get stuck in a bit of a higher end market initially, because it is just, in amongst all the people's costs in life, it is just a reality that a lot of people are not going to feel that ability to pay more when there is that cheaper alternatives sitting right there. And part of the question is, should it even be allowed to be that cheap without getting too deep into kind of economic theory? And if we can enforce better standards and have true cost economics, then that will pull things up in a more systemic way. We might need to pair that with a universal basic income and other sorts of things. And
what
so
I hear you saying, though, is
society design piece to this. But I also think, there's a danger in, let's not get we need to do both things. We definitely need big thinkers and dreamers. But, part of what I love about social entrepreneurs and social enterprises is they're very practical. They're getting on with it.
Yeah.
They've figured out a particular way to make a particular impact. And while the world is not perfect, and while on some level, if you think too much about the big picture need, you kind of get very daunted and ask existential questions as to what difference does this make anyway? They knuckle down and get on with
find a way.
Yeah, exactly. Using the resources. And to me, that's almost the definition of entrepreneurship, is making the impact you can with the resources you've got.
Give me limits, because that will just make me figure out. What you're saying is that it does, though, need to be in in a dance with all parties. Like if one person's trying to dance, like the entrepreneurs is trying to innovate. But if there isn't a political,
as well.
if there isn't a business, if business isn't being held to account to change their way, then you can't blame it all on philanthropy being stuck in their old way of operating. And so I guess that's where I see, how do we encourage, how can we see an uptick then to kind of try and tackle this challenge and kind of wrap things up. The challenge of
accelerating innovation.
Accelerating innovation. The challenge of Australia being so not up to space. Where do you think we need to kind of zero in on?
Classic questions that are overwhelming if you take them too broadly. I guess, what I have been working on,
yes.
Because I can't believe you gave me an opportunity to talk more about LendForGood before, and I noted it, but what ran straight past
I wanted to go straight there.
Circle back before we ran out of time. Not like me to miss an opportunity to do a more focused plug of
LendForGood
I'm promoting at the moment. But I guess what we thought, it's why I really believe in innovation. I feel like it is such a leverage point to making big picture impacts, and it's why 12 years ago, and it's not a coincidence I founded StartSomeGood while living in San Francisco, because I felt like that was the first time in my life I'd experienced what a pro-innovation ecosystem and culture feels like. And if I could summarize that kind of in the shape of two questions. Everything I'd encountered prior to that, working in nonprofits, doing innovation, founding, even doing social enterprise, but always kind of in a more philanthropic context. And then working in Washington, DC, was this kind of will it work dynamic. There's a lot of money for social impact, but only if they're convinced it will work. Show me the evidence it will work.
Yes.
Show me the data that it will work. Convince me it will work. And part of that comes back to a scarcity mindset. You were talking about scarcity before. And
I need a return on this.
Not even a return, just this is pure philanthropy even at the moment.
Okay.
There's just a feeling, I think, and in Australia, we, as I said before, not enough philanthropy. But even if we had global leading type amounts, or Jim Chalmers achieves his goal of doubling the level of formal philanthropy in the next however many years, it still won't be enough, guess what, to usher in utopia. It'll never feel like enough. And I feel like that no matter how many resources any given organization has, it's never enough. And I feel like that never enoughness, which is inevitable, does create this overwhelming scarcity mindset that if there's not enough, there's certainly not enough to waste. And if there's not enough to waste, then we can't fund things that we don't know whether they'll work, particularly if there's something else. That there's always enough will it work projects, and maybe that's the right role for philanthropy and government to scale up those things that will work. I don't think so. I think there's a real role to play in also funding what could work. And that's that's the approach I encountered in San Francisco. It's a could it work philosophy. So not blind to the nature of the universe and what's possible or not. But you don't need to be convinced it will work. People need to be convinced that it could work. And if they're convinced it could work, then how would we go about testing that proposition? What would be the first steps we'd take? What milestones would we need to hit in the next year to let us know whether it is working or not, or whether it's on its way to will work. And that just all of that whole energy struck me, as well as the practical infrastructure that comes along with that.
Yes.
Blogs that were covering this scene and promoting this style of approach. And you kind of talked about before you touched on kind of how messy and confusing some of the stuff around social enterprise is. And I have to say, I feel like the startup world has really nailed the language in a way that we just haven't in the social enterprise and the idea of social business, just as something that feels sexy and exciting and is an invitation to everyone, as opposed to slightly confusing and I'm not sure if I'm in the right room. Which is a lot of people, am I a social enterprise? Am I allowed to be part of this community? Coming back to belonging and community and so on. So Start Some Good was created to try and give more of that opportunity or more of that encouragement to people with a brand new idea to start some good.
Yeah.
And we focused on funding first because we thought that was a unique kind of gap, finding those first funds. And our belief was that the best place to find that risk-tolerant funding was all of us. And that key to unlocking that was essentially fractionalizing it down to individually acceptable amounts, which is what crowdfunding does. Your interesting but kind of out there project, would be way too risky for me if you asked me.
But I'll throw 20 your way.
But I could give you $50. And if you could find another 1,000 people, another 100 people to also give you $50, now you have the 5,000, which I could never give you, no matter how, I think it's cool, but I can, it's way beyond. And so on a very simple level, the kind of magic of crowdfunding is twofold. One is it just allows everyone to find their level. So for someone else, that might be a 500 project, for your uncle who's done well and has known you their whole life, your whole life at least, that, 500 might be their personally acceptable level of risk reward to chip in and be part of that project. For someone else, it might be $5. And hopefully that will help you out. That plus clear deadlines and just the gamification that comes from deadlines. Humans are great at deadlines.
Absolutely.
And the other innovation of crowdfunding essentially was to say, I will raise it by this date. And I think the truest expression of that is the all or nothing model that Kickstarter innovated and that we have always embraced, because it's a deadline that matters then, not just a kind of, aspirational deadline. And the power of deadlines that matter is kind of amazing with humans. It's just incredible what can sometimes happen in the final days of a crowdfunding campaign. But then what we discovered, what we kind of realized was that crowdfunding is just a tool at the end of the day. And it's I don't know, audio, microphones are a great tool. But to actually kind of change the world with a microphone, you probably need some coaching and support to think about how to use it and to use it successfully.
Right.
Because empowerment doesn't come from just having the tool, but from using the tool competently, and successfully. And so I didn't realize, this is part of my own naivety with business, I didn't realize how much helping people make their campaigns better fundamentally broke the crowdfunding business model. That crowdfunding is a platform business model, which means that, you kind of clip the ticket on transactions through the platform. That is enough to pay for a platform business, to spend on tech and to build a platform and to scale that. It's not enough to also run a capacity building business,
right?
Which is essentially what you do, or a due diligence service. And so we were very focused on helping people actually succeed and tell their story. And it took a long time. I don't know if we ever 100% nailed it, to be honest, but it's why today Start Some Good is a very different business, which is a capacity, primarily we still have a crowdfunding campaign, but 99% of our revenue is more programmatic or capacity building, coaching, consulting, running courses, design courses. And then that also emerged because we wanted to meet people at an earlier stage. We think you learn a lot helping people launch things, And over time, we felt like we gained real insight into what really matters at that moment, that moment of introducing a new idea and hoping that people will back you. How do you convey credibility at that moment? What's enough evidence? What do they need to see? How to think about who needs to hear about this? But often the time, some of those are really fundamental design decisions or kind of like business model decisions, target market decisions, so on. And the best time to kind of help people think through that is probably not a week before they're trying to launch a crowdfunding campaign. So part of the problem with the crowdfunding platform is people only turn up when they already think they're crowdfundable and they're not necessarily in a position to judge. And so we wanted to meet people at a stage earlier than that, which is where we launched our Good Hustle, a design program about 3 years ago now. And so that's really to kind of extract his taking kind of all the lessons learned from helping several thousand projects launch or attempt to launch and distilling that into a kind of core formula of what are the kind of core elements that every social enterprise project needs, from a clear business model to a clear impact model to a target market to a pitch to a go-to-market strategy, personal sustainability or self-care routine, as we call it, etc. So that's all very well and good. So we spent 12 years helping people launch things. And so the frustration now, but what's begun to drive me crazy is how few of them have really scaled and have ultimately actually kind of, there's so many, I've seen and worked with so many amazing founders with great ideas. And many of them have found product market fit, as they say. They're sustainable, but they're trapped. So much impact is trapped at the moment. And it's because there's this capital gap for social enterprise businesses that's called the missing middle, but is kind of more like an angel investment gap. It's that, while you can often kind of get started with a crowdfunding campaign or win an innovation grant, but I shouldn't say often. I mean, those things are hard enough and competitive enough on their own. But, I think the first 50 people can usually find through some combination of, course, like accelerators that have money, a local government
grants or whatever.
Grants, a crowdfunding campaign, family and friends. If you're ready to receive $1 million plus, there's heaps of people who'd like to give you that money. But there's this systemic gap between 50 and about $1 million that no one really wants to invest in. And it's partly because the costs of deciding, the costs of doing due diligence are such that it doesn't work.
It doesn't outweigh. It outweighs, yeah.
So philanthropy is doing some stuff in that space, but impact investing has a real desert there. And of course, that also means that not enough enterprises then do grow to the point where they're ready for that $1 to $5 to $10 million. $1.2 trillion was invested into impact investment funds last year, but most of it's just sitting in those funds because they can't find enough impact enterprises that meet their very high standards for business traction and impact measurements and validation. And so we think, in many ways, the answer to this is the same answer that we came up with before, that we need to let people contribute smaller amounts to specific projects. That part of what we think is holding back impact investing is right now to do impact investing, you probably have to invest in an impact investing fund, which means you're not really doing impact investing, you're investing in impact investing. And then the person in charge of that fund is investing other people's money. And that brings with it a variety of really strong constraints around the kind of risks you can take and the kind of returns you need to seek. And the end result of that is that almost everything is looking for those bigger deals, and almost all those impact funds are also looking for market rate returns. But not everyone needs market rate returns. It's just that through the fund model, you don't know what you're trading off for. And so just like people need to be and are willing to pay more often for a slavery-free or fair trade product or a social enterprise product, what we're proving and what we strongly believe is a lot of people are willing to take less than full commercial return. They still want a return. Of course. It's not a donation.
Well, that just shows that it's sustainable, right?
12%. Yeah. But because they know what it's a trade-off for now. So it doesn't have to be, if it wasn't kind of impact related, sure, you'd rather have 12%. But now that you know that it's 8% plus supporting a female-founded alternative protein company to put solar on the roof, or a waste management company in Tanzania to buy another truck so that they can employ 20 new people, you're like, well, that's a good deal. I'm getting, you know what the impact investment industry calls that, which shows how in some ways the whole framing at the moment is the wrong way around, because it's so it's still coming too much from the investment industry, not the impact. They would call that concessionary capital, because you're conceding on your economic returns. But think about kind of how backwards that is as an entire way of thinking about it. Like, that's not how people think about paying more for any of those other social enterprise products. When I pay a little bit more to make sure that the t-shirt I buy is slavery free and fair trade, I don't call that concessionary pricing. I'm not in fact conceding anything. I'm paying more for what I want. What I want,
you've got value increase there. Your value of your product is absolutely greater.
I'm getting the thing I want. Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm getting the kind of the sense of self-worth.
That's how you feel it. Yeah.
All of that. And so the people who are participating don't think of it as concessionary pricing. They think of it as a great deal, an awesome deal. I'm going to earn 8% and we're going to employ 20 people in Tanzania. That's unreal.
Totally.
Yeah. And so, so once there's kind of same solution, but informed by our last experience, it's a partnership model now. So LendForGood doesn't do any of the due diligence or any of the capacity building, doesn't work with the enterprises directly to help them design, to help them think about how much interest should they offer, how much money should they borrow. All of that is done by our intermediary partners. So one of the things that I've also learned is that in every ecosystem, in every niche, in every community, there are great organizations doing the hard work of finding these great innovative ideas, helping those enterprises shape up their ideas, helping them think about what they need, and often wrapping around that extra capacity building and support that they need to succeed beyond just the money. And we find those organizations and partner with them. And so only they can bring deals to the platform. And so we're trying to do this unique thing in impact investing where you get the choice that you'd get on like an equity crowdfunding platform, but with the confidence that comes from knowing that an expert has in fact reviewed it and has endorsed this particular deal, which you don't get on equity crowdfunding. And we think that kind of unique combination of choice plus confidence is the key to unlocking a lot more capital at this early stage.
Phenomenal. I think if anybody's been listening this far, which I'm sure they have been, they're going to be jumping on StartSomeGood and LendForGood to kind of learn about how to. I know us LendForGood. What did I say?
StartSomeGood. You should also jump on.
StartSomeGood and then now LendForGood.
Confusing, yeah.
Yeah, but I think people are like, I know for us, even as a nonprofit, despite You Belong being a nonprofit, and then I started Just Travel, which is a social impact business to try and generate funds and support for the nonprofit. But in both cases, like the ability to invest in, for a nonprofit, investing in capacity building, a lot of grants they want to fund a project, they want to fund something happening. They certainly don't want to fund salaries or like training or empowerment development of existing staff, because that to them in some foundations and places do, but it's that both and, right? So that ability to kind of early on provide the empowerment that's needed for thinking through what you're doing, but then the raw cash, the raw investment to actually get behind it and do it. And sounds like incredible. I can hear it sounds like it's going to be occupying you for quite some time.
Yeah, I think this is going to be the next 10 years.
10 years. So as we wrap things up, like, because I know you've got some family obligations, which are primarily important.
Yeah, the juggle is real.
Real is real. This is it. What would you leave? And instead of leaving people with advice, I'd love you to leave with just an unanswered challenge or question or struggle that you're having. Because what that does for me is it personalize the fact that, hey, Tom, I know you're an incredibly passionate person, but I know you're like, there's things that just are struggling. They're just hard. And I think when it'll help me feel like, oh, mate, like you're in the boat with me, struggling and fighting. What are you finding really hard right now? What's been a real challenge that you've had to don't necessarily have answers for? Maybe one of the listeners will reach out and be like, mate.
I have two quick ones. I do need to jump off. I want to make one a practical one, the thing that I'm literally struggling most with right now.
Yeah.
And then kind of the big picture one that I think about and don't have answers to.
Yeah.
So maybe big picture one first is just, I was so optimistic about the internet when I first started 20 years ago and its ability to build more understanding, across the world and across cultures. And I guess what we've seen that actually its real power is in building those, is what in sociology they call bonding capital, helping make people who are alike more connected, and not very good at bridging capital, which is connecting people who are unalike. And I think that's, and even crowdfunding. I mean, one part of how we teach people to crowdfund is one of our mottos. It's convening, not converting. That's true for crowdfunding. You're on the clock. You got 30 days. You got to raise money. It's not the time actually to try and like change hearts and minds. It's the time to really find the people who are already halfway, who already kind of understand there's a challenge, there's an opportunity.
I've made that mistake so many times. God.
It's the mistake of doing the opposite.
Yes. How can you be like that? Let me change your mind.
Yeah, it's kind of like this galactic prisoner's dilemma. It's almost always the right decision to focus in more on the core community, on the niche. In startups, they teach you to focus on niche, minimum viable products, minimum viable markets. That's almost always the right choice for every single one of us every time. And of course, it just happens organically. You would love the audience for this podcast to be as big as possible, but inevitably, it's a self-selecting specific group drawn to the specific conversations, and of course, it'll never be everyone. So I think that's a big picture challenge. How do we use technology in new ways, not just to make us better and better and better at bonding social capital, which it's already doing, but how do we return to the ideal that I think so many of us had 20 years ago, that it would be a driver of bridging social capital, help understanding amongst different people across difference and so on. My practical challenge is with LendForGood is that we're trying to grow. And while a lot of people are enthusiastic about the concept, it is one of the classic challenges you often see in the early stage of innovation, and particularly social innovation, of finding people who are willing, who want to do the thing, but are also willing to go first or willing to go really early. So we're looking for early adopters across the board. And particularly on the capital side, it is an interesting Venn diagram that is quite tricky, as we ourselves are, looking for supporters and to grow the platform, is that, the traditional startup investors and angel investors, they really get risk. They really get the boom bust and the potential upsides of innovation, but they honestly don't really get impact for the most part. Right. Even those who say they do, I feel like they don't really. They get it as a cherry on top, as a, if it combines with everything else they already believe and, about business and returns and all the rest of it.
Ticks the boxes.
As a cherry, that would be awesome as well. Meanwhile, the impact investment community, they get impact and are quite thoughtful about that, but they mostly don't get risk or don't have a mandate that enables them to take slightly more interesting risks in the pursuit of those outside returns that innovation can bring. So we're trying to find, the little overlap between those two. We're hoping they're not two separate circles, but the people who really do get, and, somewhat, I shouldn't be surprised. I've been in this space for a long time, but, that is the thing anyway. We'll get there, but that is certainly the thing that is occupying a lot of our time and focus at the moment, is just trying to find those people who aren't just excited about the thing and are going to use it one day, but are willing to jump in.
I put their money where their mouth is. Hey, if anyone's listening right now, you never know, that one person could be listening, and you
so
run.
If part of, we're looking for intermediaries to bring deals to the platform. Obviously, people to lend to great, and people interested in partnering with us as well. So check out the platform. That's definitely our big focus at the moment, and the thing that will unlock our growth so that we can unlock the growth for the whole sector.
Absolutely. Tom, thank you so much for your time. It's been so phenomenal, and we'll make sure everyone can find out where to get you. Really appreciate you. I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you, mate. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Juste Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you found it valuable, why not share it or leave a review and drop a comment on Spotify or YouTube? Every little bit helps get these conversations out there. And you can always reach out to me at timothybuxton.com. I'd love to hear from you. And I'll see you next time for another courageous conversation.